Hey, this is Mitch Robinson, and this video is on nutrition, and it accompanies handout number 2 for cellular and molecular medicine. In this video, we'll look at the basic components of the diet that are necessary for good nutrition and to avoid disease. And we'll look at 4 vitamins that are necessary for energy production. All right, let's get started by looking at the components in the diet necessary for good nutrition. There are 2 classes of nutrients necessary to sustain normal functions in the body. Macronutrients are required for energy production and are needed in larger amounts. Micronutrients are required in the diet in smaller amounts to perform specific metabolic functions. There are 3 classes of macronutrients that are needed for energy production: proteins, carbohydrates, and fat. Dr. Johnson will be talking about proteins and amino acids in more detail later in the next section. I'll be discussing carbohydrates in the 3rd section, and Dr. Rusnall will go into details about fats and lipids in section 4. Fiber, which is composed of various compounds that are not completely digestible, is also considered an essential macronutrient, but it does not significantly contribute to energy production. There are 2 types of micronutrients that we'll be discussing. Vitamins are organic compounds, and minerals are inorganic compounds that are needed to carry out specific metabolic processes. Okay, let's take a closer look at the 3 macronutrients we need for energy production. Protein is an important source of energy in the diet, and it's also needed for 2 other important functions, as a source of nitrogen and essential amino acids. Proteins are required to maintain nitrogen balance. We lose nitrogen through urine and other waste products, and these must be replaced mainly from nitrogen from dietary protein. There are 9 essential amino acids that cannot be synthesized by the body and which must be obtained through the diet. Dr. Johnson will talk about these in more detail. You don't have to remember them now. The current recommendation for adults is that 10 to 35% of the total calories come from protein. This is about 50 grams of protein per day for an average individual. It's recommended that 45 to 65% of the calories come from carbohydrate. There's no essential carbohydrates. That is, there are no carbohydrate molecules that are specifically required in the diet. But carbohydrates must make up a significant portion of the calories in the food we eat. It's been shown that very low carbohydrate diets have adverse effects. The recommended proportion of fat in the diet is 20 to 35% of the total calories. The type of fat is important to the proper diet. Consumption of saturated fats, which have no double bonds in the fatty acids, is associated with increased risk of cardiovascular disease. Monounsaturated fats have 1 double bonds. This type of fat is associated with decreased risk of cardiovascular disease. Polyunsaturated fats, which have 2 or more double bonds, are also associated with a decreased risk of cardiovascular disease. Polyunsaturated fats are required in the diet as a source of essential fatty acids. Linoleic and linolenic acid, these 2 fatty acids define 2 classes of polyunsaturated fat based on the location of the double bond nearest the methyl end of the molecule. Linoleic acid is an N-6 or omega-6 fatty acid, and alpha-linolenic acid is an N-3 or omega-3 fatty acid. Each of these fatty acids can be converted in the body to other fatty acids in the same family by addition of carbons and double bonds. Linoleic acid can be converted to arachidonic acid, which is a precursor for the formation of signaling molecules such as prostaglandins and leukotrienes. These are known as eicosanoids. Alpha-linolenic acid can also be converted to longer, more complex molecules, including eicosapentaenoic acid and docosahexaenoic acid. Again, these are omega-3 fatty acids, and they can also be used to make eicosanoids. N-6 fatty acids are present in meat and vegetable oil in large amounts. N-3 fatty acids are found more in fish and in some plants. It's important to maintain a proper balance of omega-3 and omega-6 fats in the diet. Omega-3 fat tends to be anti-inflammatory and will protect against cardiovascular disease. In order to have good health, we need to maintain a balance of energy intake and expenditure. On page 4 of your handout is a diagram showing that energy is obtained from the food we eat, and the energy can be stored or expended. We store energy as carbohydrate in the form of glycogen and fat in the form of triglyceride in adipose tissue. We'll discuss the processes for this later in the course. There are 3 principal components of the energy we expend. Obligatory energy expenditure used to be referred to as basal metabolic rate. This is the energy we use when completely at rest to maintain our basic metabolism. This includes processes such as ion transport, protein synthesis, and basic functions such as breathing. This component is fairly constant. A second component is physical activity or movement, muscular work. This component is variable, so we can increase our energy consumption and lose weight by increasing our physical activity. A third component of energy expenditure is adaptive thermogenesis. This is energy generated as heat production that changes in response to different conditions. For example, when it's cold, our bodies produce more heat. Also, when we fast, our bodies respond by producing less heat and conserving energy. This is a problem when we diet in order to lose weight. Our bodies respond to weight loss by conserving energy. The table on page 5 shows the amount of energy we get from the 3 macronutrient classes. Fat is rich in energy with a yield of 9 kilocalories per gram. Carbohydrate and protein yield 4 kilocalories per gram. Alcohol, though not considered a nutrient, it's often part of our diet, and it's fairly high in calories with 7 kilocalories per gram. The macronutrients that are needed in the diet are shown in the table on page 5. This includes the vitamins required in the diet, both water-soluble and fat-soluble, and the minerals required in the diet. There are those required in larger amounts, macrominerals, and those that are required in smaller amounts, microminerals. Now let's take a look at 4 vitamins that are important in energy production. These vitamins are required to make coenzymes or cofactors. Coenzymes are chemical compounds used by enzymes or proteins to carry out their activity. There are many metabolic reactions that we can't perform using the amino acids on enzymes. We require fairly complex molecules in the diet to carry out these reactions. Coenzymes may be covalently or tightly bound to enzymes, or they may be loosely bound and act more as carriers that move between enzymes, and these are referred to often as co-substrates. We want to take a look at the following 4 vitamins: thiamine, riboflavin, niacin, and pantothenic acid. And these are vitamins B1, B2, B3, and B5. There is no vitamin B4. Thiamine, or vitamin B1, is required in the diet in order to make the coenzyme thiamine pyrophosphate. This part of the molecule is thiamine, and phosphates are added to make thiamine pyrophosphate. The function of thiamine pyrophosphate is for the transfer of carbon groups. The carbon shown by the arrow here can react with carbon groups. We'll look more specifically at this reaction later. Thiamine pyrophosphate is used by enzymes in carbohydrate metabolism. So a deficiency in this vitamin results in an inability to generate energy, and particularly to generate energy from carbohydrates. Thiamine deficiency can result in the disease beriberi. The bran portion of grain is a good source of thiamine, and this disease is usually observed where people eat polished rice or grains with the bran removed. The symptoms of beriberi include weakness, weight loss, and eventually convulsions and tachycardia, or rapid heartbeat. In the U.S. and more developed countries, thiamine deficiency is more often seen as Wernicke-Korsakoff syndrome. This is most often found in chronic alcoholics who have a very restricted diet. The symptoms of Wernicke-Korsakoff syndrome are confusion, nystagmus, which is involuntary eye movement, and ataxia, or a lack of muscle coordination. Niacin, or vitamin B3, is also known as nicotinic acid. This vitamin is needed to make the coenzyme nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide, or NAD. This part of the molecule is niacin, or nicotinamide. A carboxyl here would be nicotinic acid. So if we have this in the diet, we can add ribose, phosphates, and adenosine to make NAD. This hydroxyl group can have a phosphate added to it to make a similar coenzyme called nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide phosphate, or NADP. Both NAD and NADP serve as carriers of electrons. The thiazole ring shown here is the oxidized form, that is without added electrons, and is shown here in the reduced form. When we talk about carrying electrons, this usually involves carrying protons as well. Recall that a proton plus an electron is a hydrogen atom, and in metabolism we often need to move pairs of electrons, and we do that by moving pairs of hydrogen atoms. So let's say we have a substrate, shown here as RH2, that can lose two hydrogens. NAD can act as an acceptor. In the oxidized form, it has a positive charge, and we usually abbreviate this as NAD+. Two hydrogens are removed from the substrate. NAD acts as an acceptor of two electrons and a proton, and one proton stays in solution. The coenzyme NADP carries electrons in the same way as NAD. But cells use electrons, or hydrogens, from NADP differently than they do NAD. NAD electrons are used mainly for energy production in the mitochondria, which is a catabolic process. NADP electrons are used mainly for biosynthesis, which is an anabolic process. A deficiency of niacin results in the condition known as pellagra. Skin lesions are the most common sign, particularly this sort of ring around the neck. Diarrhea, dermatitis, and dementia are the usual signs of pellagra. Niacin has another interesting activity. It's often prescribed to improve serum cholesterol. Taking niacin decreases VLDL, or bad cholesterol, and increases HDL, or good cholesterol. This effect requires a much higher dose than that required to synthesize the coenzymes. It takes about 2 to 6 grams daily to provide improved cholesterol rather than a few milligrams a day for the vitamin requirement. Because the dosage for this effect is so different, we can expect that niacin acts by a different mechanism unrelated to transport of electrons by coenzymes or NADP. A side effect of taking niacin at the high dosage is that it produces a flushing reaction where the skin and face turn very red. There may be a burning or itching sensation. This lasts about 10 to 15 minutes. Riboflavin, also known as vitamin B2, is a precursor for the coenzymes flavin mononucleotide, FMN, and flavin adenine dinucleotide, FAD. The structure of riboflavin is shown here, and we can add a phosphate group to make FMN, flavin mononucleotide. Another phosphate, an adenine added, and you have flavin adenine dinucleotide, or FAD. Both FAD and FMN are carriers of electrons. FAD can accept 2 electrons and 2 protons, or 2 hydrogens. So in a typical reaction, 2 hydrogen atoms are transferred from a substrate to reduced FAD to generate the oxidized substrate and reduced FAD, which is abbreviated FADH2. Riboflavin deficiency produces dermatitis, but this is very rare because riboflavin is so common in the foods we eat. Pantothenic acid, or vitamin B5, is required to make coenzyme A. If we have pantothenic acid in the diet, it can be converted to coenzyme A through the addition of adenosine phosphates and a cysteine. The sulfur group of the cysteine is the reactive side of the coenzyme that forms a thioester when it reacts with the carboxyl of the acyl group. Coenzyme A in the reduced form is abbreviated CoA with an SH to show the reduced sulfur atom. The root word pantothenic means from everywhere. This vitamin is found in most all foods, and so deficiencies of pantothenic acid and coenzyme A are very rare. So that concludes our video on nutrition.